The year was 1916, and George V sat upon the throne of Britain, ruler of the empire upon which the sun famously never set. Yet even the greatest empire could not shield itself from the weight of war. The king, though distant from the front lines, bore the burden of command decisions made in his name. He did not design the strategies, but his signature, his speeches, his presence made the war his own as much as it belonged to the generals in France. Every newspaper carried his image, urging men to enlist, reminding the public that this was a fight not just for land, but for civilization itself. His words echoed through recruiting halls and posters in London streets. Britain must endure, Britain must sacrifice. The empire had promised its king millions of volunteers. Farmers, clerks, miners, students, all now clothed in khaki. They left behind shops, families, and villages, believing they served both God and crown. For George V, every regiment represented the heartbeat of the empire, every casualty another scar on his reign. He was not a ruler untouched by loss. His own cousins ruled in Berlin and St. Petersburg, and war had turned their blood ties into enemies. His empire was vast, but its armies bled in France. As news from the front poured in, he listened to the general's plans with cautious hope. Field Marshal Douglas Haig spoke with confidence, assuring that this next offensive, this great push near the river Somme, would shatter the German line and relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. Haig's voice was steady, calculated, promising that the weight of Britain's industry and manpower could finally turn the war. The king nodded, but behind his eyes there was unease. He had seen too many telegrams bearing the names of dead boys from Yorkshire, Wales, and Scotland. Still, he dared not voice doubt. Monarchs could not question generals openly. So he gave his blessing. Britain would hurl its strength into the Somme. George V visited camps, speaking to soldiers before the storm. He walked among rows of men polishing rifles, tightening boots, writing final letters home. His presence mattered to them. They cheered him, saluted him, saw in him the symbol of unity. But the king knew what many of them did not. Most would not return. He carried that knowledge silently, unable to show the weight pressing his crown down. This was the paradox of kingship in modern war. George V, the figurehead of empire, had no control over the mud, the machine guns, or the shells that would soon define the Somme. Yet when the slaughter came, it would be remembered as his war, fought under his reign, in his name. And so, as Britain's youth prepared to march into history, the king remained at Windsor and Buckingham, waiting for the reports that would turn strategy into blood. Field Marshal Douglas Haig believed in the offensive. He was convinced that sheer determination, combined with the vast resources of the British Empire, could finally crack the German front. To him, the Somme would be the hammer blow. He promised the king, the cabinet, and the nation that the attack would not fail. The plan, bold in scope yet tragically rigid in design, relied on an artillery barrage of such magnitude that no German trench, no machine gun, no barbed wire could survive. In Haig's view, this was to be the moment Britain asserted itself as the dominant partner in the war, no longer the junior ally to France. Since 1914, the British Expeditionary Force had grown from a small professional army into a vast host of citizen soldiers, trained hastily but armed with modern firepower. Haig intended to use them en masse. The French, drained by Verdun, had begged for relief. Britain would deliver it, not only to support its ally but to demonstrate its own strength. The king listened to Haig's confidence, aware of the enormous weight this offensive carried. Haig and his staff insisted that 7 days of relentless bombardment would pulverize German positions. Millions of shells would rain down upon the enemy lines, cutting their wire, burying their bunkers, and blasting their morale beyond recovery. After the guns ceased, Haig declared, the infantry would simply walk forward, occupying the ruins where the German army had once stood. A great breakthrough was the phrase repeated in briefings. Haig envisioned cavalry sweeping through the gap, rolling into the open countryside beyond, forcing the Kaiser's armies to retreat. The king heard not only the optimism but also the hidden desperation. Britain had already endured Gallipoli, a campaign that had drained lives for little gain. The public needed victory. Parliament needed proof that the war was winnable. And the king himself, though a constitutional monarch, knew his image was bound to the outcome. He did not dictate Haig's orders. but he lent them the aura of royal authority when he endorsed the offensive in speeches and ceremonies. Behind the plans, there was the machinery of preparation. Throughout the spring of 1916, the railways of Britain and France worked without pause, hauling artillery pieces, mountains of shells, barbed wire, duckboards, and rations to the front. Soldiers practiced in fields of chalk and mud, rehearsing the advance they were told would be simple. Entire battalions of young men, drawn from the same towns and villages, waited in the trenches, writing in diaries about the day they would finally prove themselves in battle. George V visited training camps, meeting officers who recited Haig's assurances. "The wire will be gone," they said. "The Germans will be broken." The king shook hands with privates, looked into the eyes of boys who had left school only months earlier. He said the words expected of him: encouragement, pride, duty. But when he returned to his carriage, he sat in silence, his mind heavy with the knowledge that strategy did not always match reality. He remembered Ypres, where promises of swift victory had dissolved into endless mud and fire. Yet the machinery was already in motion. Haig had committed. The Empire had committed. Britain had no choice but to see it through. The king, bound by his role, could only watch as Haig's plan consumed everything around it: men, weapons, hopes, and soon lives. When June drew to its close, the pieces were in place. Hundreds of miles of trenches stretched across northern France. Ammunition dumps overflowed. The generals' maps showed arrows and breakthroughs. The soldiers sharpened bayonets and rehearsed the step from trench to battlefield. Haig's plan was set. His confidence never wavered, even as some voices of caution warned that the Germans were not broken, that deep shelters might protect them. But Haig believed, and with his belief he carried Britain, the Empire, and the king into the jaws of the Somme. For 7 endless days the Western Front trembled beneath the roar of British artillery. Beginning on June 24, 1916, the guns spoke without rest, a thunder that stretched from horizon to horizon. Entire villages in the English countryside heard the faint echo, the ground shaking even across the channel. To those at the front, it was not merely sound but a physical presence, a wall of fire that pressed against their chests and rattled their teeth. More than 1.5 million shells were hurled across no man's land, an avalanche of steel designed to annihilate everything that lived or stood in the German lines. The king, kept informed daily, read reports describing the bombardment as the greatest in history. His generals assured him that nothing could survive such fury. He saw the numbers: batteries of 18-pounder field guns, heavy howitzers, naval guns dragged inland, all concentrated in a single stretch of France. The British Empire had harnessed its industry, and here was the proof: an unending storm of explosives pounding the enemy into dust. To the soldiers in the trenches, the experience was both awe-inspiring and suffocating. The air never cleared. Black smoke, dust, and the stench of powder hung over the battlefield like a second sky. Men covered their ears, yet the sound penetrated bone. Many went half-deaf within days, ears bleeding, minds disoriented. Sleep was impossible. Even behind the lines, supply carriers and reserve units stumbled through the constant concussions, their nerves unraveling under the ceaseless thunder. Haig's staff believed this was science at work, mathematics turned into victory. Every yard of German trench was mapped, every suspected machine gun nest targeted, every belt of wire marked for destruction. The theory was simple: bombard long enough and hard enough, and the enemy would be crushed. By the 7th day, officers were convinced there would be little left but rubble and corpses. "The Hun will be finished," they told the men. But the truth was more complex. Many of the shells were shrapnel, designed to kill soldiers in the open, not destroy deep dugouts or thick belts of wire. Much of the ammunition was defective, shells that either failed to explode or burst too shallow to have effect. The German defenses were not the shallow ditches of 1914, but fortresses carved into chalk and clay. Their bunkers were sunk 30 feet underground, reinforced with timber and concrete, stocked with food, water, and ammunition. For the men inside, the bombardment was terrifying but survivable. They waited in the dark, the walls shaking, dust falling from the ceilings, but still alive. Meanwhile, on the British side, men crowded the parapets to watch the spectacle. They saw entire sections of land erupt in fountains of earth. They saw trees disintegrate, Villages vanish in clouds of smoke. To them, it was proof that their commanders were right. When the whistle blew, when the order came to advance, they expected little more than a walk across devastated ground. Some even joked about marching in parade order. Letters home carried optimism. The wire is surely gone. The Germans must all be dead. They trusted the plan because it seemed impossible that anything could survive the storm unleashed. The king received telegrams from Hague describing progress, the guns firing as scheduled, the enemy silenced. To the monarch, far from the front, it sounded as though the offensive was unfolding as promised. He prepared statements of encouragement, reminding the empire that Britain's sons were about to achieve a blow that would echo through history. Yet beneath the official tone, unease lingered. He knew from past battles that certainty often collapsed at the moment of contact. But with the barrage shaking the soil of France into a wasteland, hope seemed justified. And still the guns fired, day after day, night after night, without pause. Entire hills were flattened, rivers diverted, the very landscape erased. Birds fled, animals perished, civilians miles away covered their ears in terror. By June 30th, the earth was unrecognizable, churned into an alien world of craters and ruins. Hague's men believed the war was already won. George V, though cautious, allowed himself to imagine that perhaps this time the sacrifice would bring the breakthrough Britain so desperately sought. The bombardment ended on the evening of June 30th. Silence returned, heavy and unnatural after a week of chaos. The soldiers looked across no man's land at the German lines, cloaked in smoke, torn by shell holes, wire seemingly shredded. They believed nothing remained alive. They waited for the whistle that would signal the dawn of July 1st, when they would rise from their trenches and step into history. The king went to bed that night in Windsor Palace, restless, knowing that tens of thousands of his subjects would march at sunrise into the unknown. He prayed the generals had been right, that the guns had done their work. What he could not hear, what no man in Britain could yet know, was that beneath the shattered surface, deep in bunkers, the enemy still waited. Machine guns were cleaned, belts of ammunition stacked, and German soldiers prepared themselves calmly for the slaughter about to begin. Beneath the earth, in the labyrinths dug by German engineers, the week-long storm of steel had been endured with clenched teeth and clenched fists. The bombardment had shaken their shelters like earthquakes, collapsing weaker tunnels and filling the air with choking dust, but most of the men survived. They knew the British barrage was vast, but they also knew its secret weakness. Much of the shellfire was wasted on the surface. The British believed that blasting craters and throwing shrapnel across open ground would sweep the enemy away. But the Germans were not sitting in shallow trenches waiting to be torn apart. They had been ordered deep underground, into dugouts reinforced with concrete and timber, some carved 30 feet below the surface. Inside these bunkers, soldiers sat in near darkness, listening to the thunder above them. Food and water had been stockpiled. Ammunition was stacked in neat rows. Machine guns, carefully oiled and wrapped, waited for the moment the bombardment ceased. In the dim light of lanterns, officers reassured their men that once the British infantry came forward, they would have their chance. Morale did not break. Fear was present. No man could sit under such fire without trembling, but discipline held. They whispered to one another, smoked, prayed, and waited. The German High Command had prepared for this moment. They had studied the pattern of Allied offensives since 1915 and understood the logic of the British plan. The barrage would end, and when it did, the enemy would rise from their trenches believing the battlefield was safe. That was when the machine guns would speak. Behind the first lines, artillery batteries were already positioned, their barrels trained on no man's land, ready to unleash counterfire the moment the British advanced. Above ground, the landscape had been devastated. Trees were gone, villages reduced to skeletons, fields cratered into a moonscape. From a distance, it seemed impossible that life could remain in such ruin. That illusion was exactly what the German defenders relied upon. Their wire, though battered, remained in many places intact. Entire belts still stretched across the front, bent and tangled, but deadly enough to stop an advancing soldier. Machine gun emplacements, buried in hardened positions, had survived the storm. To the British watching from their lines, it looked like empty land. To the Germans climbing up from their dugouts, it was the perfect killing ground. As June faded into July, the last shells of the bombardment fell, and silence settled for the first time in a week. The Germans knew what that meant. Officers barked orders. Men climbed from their underground shelters, brushing dust from their uniforms, hauling ammunition crates to the surface. Machine guns were set into position, barrels mounted, belts fed. The trenches that had seemed lifeless only hours before filled with movement. Rifles were checked, bayonets fixed, binoculars raised. Some German soldiers described the eerie calm before dawn on July 1, 1916. The air was heavy with smoke and the stench of cordite. No birds sang, no animals moved. Across no man's land, they could just make out the outlines of British trenches, silent and waiting. The defenders crouched low, fingers on triggers, eyes fixed on the parapet. They knew the signal would come with the first light of day. Back in Britain, the king awoke that morning to a world holding its breath. Reports told him the week-long bombardment had gone exactly as planned. Haig's staff believed the Germans were finished. Newspapers, primed by military communiques, spoke of the great push about to begin. The Empire expected triumph. The king, dressed in uniform, awaited word of progress, his heart heavy with the knowledge that by nightfall thousands of families across Britain and the Dominions would receive telegrams of death or injury. At the front, German officers moved calmly along their trenches, encouraging their men. They knew they held the advantage now. The British believed they had destroyed them, but in truth they had survived almost untouched. They knew what would come next. The whistle, the rising figures in khaki, the slow advance into open ground. The German machine gunners adjusted their sights, set their ranges, and prepared to cut down whatever came. The stage was set. Above ground, the silence of dawn suggested victory to one side and opportunity to the other. Below ground, soldiers wiped sweat from their brows, tightened grips on their weapons, and waited for the sun to rise. The week of fire had ended, but the true storm was about to begin. July 1, 1916. Dawn broke over the Somme front with a pale, uncertain light. A mist clung to the shattered fields, hanging low over the craters and twisted wire. For the British soldiers crouched in their forward trenches, rifles slung across shoulders and bayonets fixed, this was the moment they had been drilled for. All night they had waited, pressed against sandbags, whispering final words, writing hurried notes to sweethearts and families, some tucking the letters into tunics so they might be found later. Chaplains had moved among them, offering prayers, blessings, and sometimes only silent presence. The men knew what was coming, even if their officers insisted it would be easy. At 7:30 a.m., the silence shattered. A shrill, piercing sound cut across the lines. The officer's whistle, blown again and again until every man could hear. It was the signal. Across 20 miles of front, thousands of British soldiers began climbing over the parapets of their trenches. They carried rifles, packs heavy with supplies, entrenching tools, water bottles, and sometimes even soccer balls and cigarettes, tokens of home to steady their nerves. The plan required them to walk, not run. They were ordered to move slowly, in steady waves, rifles at the slope, maintaining formation as if on parade ground. Generals feared that if men rushed forward, they would become disorganized, and the advance would collapse into chaos. So they rose, one after another, and stepped into no man's land. Along the front, entire battalions from Yorkshire, Lancashire, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland moved forward together. These were PALS battalions, units raised from the same towns and neighborhoods, groups of men who had enlisted side by side in 1914 and 1915. Friends from the same factories, the same football clubs, even the same classrooms, now walked shoulder to shoulder into the killing ground. For a few moments, there was only the crunch of boots in churned earth and the creak of equipment. The men expected to find a wasteland with no defenders. They believed the bombardment had cleared everything. Some even smiled grimly, certain this would be more of a march than a fight. But the silence was deceptive. In the German lines, soldiers waited, crouched behind machine guns already zeroed in on the killing zones. They had watched the British men rise, watched the waves begin to move, and waited for them to come within range. The British advance had to cross hundreds of yards of open ground that had been blasted by shells, but still contained belts of barbed wire, some as thick as hedgerows. Then came the first bursts. From the German side, machine guns erupted with a mechanical rhythm, short, controlled bursts, then longer streams of fire. The sound was like tearing cloth, rapid and merciless. Entire lines of advancing soldiers fell instantly, scythed down before they had even reached the halfway point. Men crumpled where they stood, some dropping without a sound, others screaming as they fell. Still, the whistles blew behind them, and officers shouted for the men to keep moving. The plan demanded momentum. More waves climbed out of the trenches, moving forward into the storm. The battlefield became a vision of chaos, khaki figures pressing onward, machine gun fire hammering them down, shrapnel shells bursting overhead. The German artillery, long silent, now roared to life, filling the air with explosions that tore bodies apart and cratered the already shattered ground. From his command posts, Haig received initial messages that the advance had begun as scheduled. His optimism remained, but in the field, battalion after battalion was being annihilated within minutes. Some units never reached the German wire. They were cut to pieces in the open, bodies tangled in coils of barbed steel, rifles falling from lifeless hands. Others reached the wire, but found it largely intact. The bombardment had failed to destroy it in many sectors. Men clawed at it with bare hands, hacked at it with bayonets, tried to throw themselves over, only to be caught in the teeth of machine gun fire. Among the advancing ranks, courage was everywhere. Groups of men pressed forward despite the slaughter, some crawling on their bellies, others leaping into shell holes and firing back in vain. But bravery made no difference against the mathematics of the defense. The Germans had prepared for this, had calculated angles of fire to cover every approach. The battlefield became a grid of death, where each movement forward meant stepping directly into a line of bullets. In London, George V awaited reports, unaware of the scale of disaster unfolding in France. The telegrams reaching his desk spoke of heroism, of men moving forward in good order, of steady progress. The truth, that entire brigades were being obliterated, would take hours, even days, to reach him in full. But at the front, by mid-morning, the reality was clear. The Somme was not a breakthrough. It was a massacre. And yet, the whistles still blew, more orders were given, and the men, loyal to their officers, loyal to their king, kept rising from the trenches, climbing into no man's land, and walking into the storm. The first bursts of fire had shattered the illusion, but the killing had only just begun. Across the entire stretch of the Somme front, the British advance met the same fate. Men walking steadily forward into a wall of bullets. The Germans had waited patiently for this moment, and when it came, their discipline, their preparation, and their firepower unleashed a storm of destruction that no amount of bravery could overcome. The sound of it was unlike anything the young British soldiers had ever known. Machine guns did not fire as rifles did, with cracks and pauses between shots. Instead, they poured out streams of death, a mechanical stuttering roar that ripped the air apart. It was said that a single German Maxim could spit out 600 rounds a minute, its bullets cutting across open fields with the precision of a scythe. In dugouts and firing nests positioned to cover every approach, teams of German gunners worked with grim efficiency. One man fed belts of ammunition, another cooled the barrel, while the gunner adjusted his aim, sweeping his fire left to right, back again, mowing down rows of men as easily as a farmer cut wheat. The British soldiers pressed forward because they had been ordered to, because their commanders told them the enemy had already been destroyed, because they trusted in the chain of command that had brought them here. Whole platoons rose together, their boots sinking in the mud, their packs dragging on their shoulders. Within seconds, many were lying lifeless, riddled with bullets, their bodies collapsing into the very ground they had been told would be safe. For those who survived the first bursts, the horror only deepened. They could see their friends falling all around them, could hear the choking screams, could feel the hot air as bullets whipped past their ears. Yet still they moved forward because to stop meant disobedience, and to turn back meant disgrace. In some sectors, men managed to crawl forward into shell craters, shallow holes gouged by the week-long bombardment. But the craters offered little protection. They were often too small to hide more than 1 or 2 men, and the sides crumbled under the weight of a body. Worse still, German artillery quickly found these hiding places and filled them with shrapnel and high explosive. Shell fragments tore through flesh, blasting apart men who had believed themselves momentarily safe. The barbed wire, which Haig's planners had insisted would be destroyed by the bombardment, remained a nightmare obstacle. Thick belts stretched across the battlefield, tangled and twisted but still unbroken. Soldiers reached it with bayonets in hand, hacking desperately, only to find themselves caught in the steel. Whole groups of men became ensnared, struggling like trapped animals while machine gun fire cut them down. Some were left hanging in the wire, lifeless, their uniforms torn, their blood soaking the strands. Officers tried to keep order. Whistles blew, swords raised, commands shouted over the roar of fire. Forward! Keep going! Don't stop! They knew the plan demanded progress, that the weight of numbers would somehow carry them through. But their courage made them easy targets. German gunners often aimed first at the officers, recognizing their caps and insignia. Many fell within minutes of leaving the trench, leaving their men leaderless and bewildered. The German defenders, emerging fully now from their bunkers, fought with grim determination. They were not invincible. Many had been shaken, some buried alive by the bombardment, others wounded in the chaos. But the survivors were hardened, disciplined, and positioned exactly where they needed to be. They could fire in overlapping fields, ensuring that every stretch of no man's land was covered. Their artillery, long silent, now roared with precision, shells bursting among the advancing British formations, tearing limbs from bodies, blasting men into fragments that rained across the churned earth. Reports from the front later told of entire battalions erased within minutes. The 10th West Yorkshires, the 2nd Middlesex, the 1st Newfoundland Regiment, all were thrown into the advance, and all were slaughtered. In some units, more than half the men were killed or wounded in the first hour. The Newfoundland Regiment, attacking near Beaumont Hamel, suffered losses so severe that out of 801 men, only 68 answered roll call the next day. And still the orders came. Behind the first waves, more men waited in trenches, hearing the chaos ahead but compelled to follow the same path. They climbed the ladders, stumbled into no man's land, and joined the dead and dying already strewn across the fields. The ground became a carpet of bodies, khaki uniforms spread across the craters and wire, some twitching in agony, others motionless. Blood pooled in shell holes, mingling with mud, filling boots, soaking bandages that were applied only to be torn open again by the next burst of fire. By mid-morning, the battlefield was no longer an advance, it was a slaughterhouse. Runners carrying messages were cut down before they reached their destinations. Stretcher-bearers attempting to retrieve the wounded were shot as they moved, their white armbands offering no protection. Horses pulling ammunition carts bolted in terror, dragging broken equipment through the carnage. Smoke and dust hung so thick that men could barely see 10 yards ahead. Yet the machine guns never ceased, firing blindly into the haze and still finding targets. The king, far from the front, could not yet grasp the full magnitude of the disaster. The first telegram spoke of progress, of men holding captured ground, of the offensive developing as expected. In truth, there was almost nothing to celebrate. By noon, tens of thousands of British soldiers lay dead or maimed, their bodies scattered across no man's land. The Somme had already become the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, and it was not yet over. Yet still the whistles blew. More waves prepared to rise. More men shouldered rifles, climbed ladders, and walked into the storm. For George V, the monarch whose empire had sent these men forward, the reckoning of this day would mark not just a military failure, but a human catastrophe that scarred his reign forever. The slaughter of July 1st did not happen in one blow, but unfolded minute by minute, hour by hour, as the reality of the Somme revealed itself. By mid-morning, along the entire front, the British army had been ripped open. Yet the command structure, so certain of victory, refused to believe the scale of the disaster. Orders kept pushing new battalions forward, as though sheer willpower could carry men through a hurricane of bullets. In the trenches, officers shouted over the din, blowing whistles, raising swords, waving revolvers in the air. The men obeyed because obedience had been drilled into them since enlistment. They climbed ladders slick with mud, clambered over parapets reinforced with sandbags, and stepped into no man's land where the air itself seemed alive with steel. Once exposed, each second was a gamble. Bullets tore through ranks before a man had taken 10 paces. The carefully maintained lines of advance, 2 men deep, shoulder to shoulder, with measured spacing, disintegrated in moments. Those in front fell. Those behind stumbled over their corpses and were cut down in turn. The experience for those caught in the open was a nightmare of sound and sight. The crack of rifles blended with the relentless hammer of machine guns, the explosions of artillery, the shrieks of men hit in the gut, the chest, the throat. Some cried out for mothers they would never see again. Others fell silently, clutching at wounds as if to hold their lives from spilling out. The wounded tried to crawl backward toward the safety of the trenches, but most never made it more than a few yards before collapsing. Shell craters became both refuge and grave, filled with blood, water, and broken bodies. In sectors like Gamacourt and Serra, entire divisions were annihilated. Men advanced uphill into fortified German positions that had survived the bombardment intact. The German gunners, emerging from their deep dugouts, had perfect visibility across the slopes. They did not waste ammunition. They fired short, controlled bursts, cutting down one group, then swinging their barrels to the next. British battalions that had formed up so proudly at dawn ceased to exist before the morning was out. One of the cruelest truths of the day was that the PALS battalions paid the heaviest price. These units, raised from single towns, villages, and workplaces, meant that the losses struck communities with unbearable force. The Accrington PALS, recruited from a single Lancashire town, advanced at Serra. Within half an hour, hundreds were dead. Out of 720 men, barely 150 were left unscathed. In Accrington itself, the impact was devastating. In one morning, nearly every family received news of a son, a brother, or a husband killed or wounded. Similar tragedies struck across the country, from Sheffield to Leeds, from Tyneside to Ulster. The Somme was not just a military defeat. It was a communal bereavement on a scale Britain had never seen. At Beaumont Hamel, the Newfoundland Regiment stepped forward. They had been told they would be moving into gaps created by earlier assaults. Instead, they found intact wire and untouched German positions. The Newfoundlanders advanced across open ground, silhouetted against the skyline. German machine gunners later described the ease with which they cut the men down. Within minutes, the regiment was gone. Out of 801 soldiers, only 68 answered roll call the next day. For Newfoundland, still a separate dominion of the Empire at the time, this single morning was seared into national memory. By noon, the battlefield was an abattoir. No man's land, already churned by the week-long bombardment, was now layered with bodies. Khaki uniforms lay in grotesque heaps, faces pressed into mud, arms outstretched toward safety that had never been reached. Some men writhed in agony, calling out for stretcher-bearers who could not come. Any movement above ground drew fire. Medical parties tried to crawl forward under Red Cross armbands, but even they were targeted. Many stretcher-bearers were killed before reaching a single casualty. For those still unhit, the terror became mechanical. Men marched forward almost in a trance, their minds numb, as if denying what was happening all around them. They stumbled over corpses, ducked instinctively at shells, flinched at the whistle of bullets, yet kept moving because the orders said they must. Others dropped their rifles and crawled into craters, clutching at the ground, unwilling to rise again. Some wept openly, others prayed, others cursed their commanders for sending them into such slaughter. And yet, in scattered places along the vast line, tiny gains were made. At Mametz and Montauban, British units managed to capture sections of the German front trench, where brutal hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Bayonets plunged into throats, rifle butts smashed skulls, grenades burst in confined spaces, turning dugouts into charnel houses. These victories, however, were rare and isolated, and they came at horrific cost. For every yard taken, hundreds of men lay dead. The German soldiers, too, felt the strain. Their ears rang from the unending gunfire, their shoulders ached from the recoil of their weapons, their eyes burned from smoke. They saw the bodies piling high and could not escape the stench of blood and powder. But they held their ground. They had the advantage of defense, and they knew it. Some even expressed pity for the British, describing the advance as suicidal, like watching men walk into death with eyes open. Back in Britain, the scale of the disaster remained hidden. Official communiques were vague, speaking of steady progress and gallant advances. George V, reading the first reports from the War Office, could not yet grasp the enormity of what was happening. He had no way of knowing that entire battalions had been wiped out, that communities across his empire would soon be in mourning. To him, July 1st was still unfolding, still uncertain. But in France, for the men of the British Army, the truth was undeniable. By the time evening fell, the fields of the Somme were strewn with nearly 60,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. No other day in British military history had cost so much so quickly. The whistles that had blown at dawn had called not to victory, but to mass death. And still, even after that first day's horror, the offensive did not end. Haig and his commanders would insist that the battle continue, that the line must press forward, that the sacrifice could not be in vain. For the soldiers, it meant that the killing ground of July 1st was only the beginning of a struggle that would drag on for months, grinding down an entire generation. By the evening of July 1st, 1916, the sun sank low over northern France, casting its pale light across fields that had been transformed into a landscape of ruin. The British soldiers who had survived the day crouched in craters and shattered trenches, surrounded by the dead and dying. Some clutched rifles with white-knuckled hands. Others pressed bandages against wounds that would not stop bleeding. The cries of the wounded carried across no man's land. Men calling for stretcher-bearers, for water, for mothers who would never come. Yet most of these voices went unanswered. To move above the parapet was still to invite death. German machine guns, tirelessly manned, continued to sweep the ground, shooting at any hint of movement. The king, hundreds of miles away, could not hear those cries. He sat in Windsor, waiting for telegrams that summarized the day's events in cold, clipped language. The first reports reached him late in the evening. The offensive had begun successfully, certain gains had been made, and our troops behaved with the utmost gallantry. The numbers of dead and wounded were not yet included. George V, who had been told that this offensive would be the great turning point, permitted himself a moment of guarded relief. He trusted his generals. He trusted the plan. But he could not know, yet, that the plan had consumed his soldiers like a furnace devours coal. At the front, the horror of the day was only half complete. Survivors crouched in shell holes, listening to the groans around them, knowing their friends were bleeding out within arm's reach. Some crawled desperately through the mud, dragging shattered legs behind them. Others tried to drink from puddles fouled with blood and cordite. The battlefield was no longer a place for men, but for corpses, and yet those still alive endured it minute by minute. The stretcher-bearers were heroes of that evening. Crawling on their stomachs, dragging stretchers through craters, they tried to reach the wounded. Many never came back, gunned down as they carried men toward safety. Those who did manage to return carried bodies so mutilated they could scarcely be recognized. Field dressing stations behind the lines overflowed with casualties. Surgeons, their sleeves soaked in blood, worked with knives and saws until their arms trembled from exhaustion. Amputated limbs piled up outside tents, covered in flies. The moans of the half-conscious filled the air, men begging for morphine, begging for an end to the pain. In some sectors, the British had reached the German lines and clung desperately to small footholds. At Mametz, Montauban, and a handful of other points, soldiers held on to captured trenches, fighting hand-to-hand against counterattacks. The smell of cordite and flesh mixed in those dark tunnels, where men fought with bayonets, knives, fists, anything they could grasp. The ground won in these places was measured not in miles, but in yards, and the cost of each yard was staggering. For the Germans, the day had been both triumphant and terrible. They had survived the longest bombardment in history. They had mowed down waves of attackers. But they had also seen the fields piled with British dead in numbers that even they could scarcely believe. German diaries record astonishment. They just kept coming, as if they did not care for life. Others felt pity, describing the British assault as madness, an assault doomed from the moment it began. Yet pity did not stop the bullets. The guns kept firing until barrels overheated, until ammunition belts had to be replaced, until arms ached from the recoil. As darkness fell, the battlefield revealed itself in all its horror. No man's land was carpeted with bodies, some lying still, others writhing in agony. The air was filled with the buzzing of flies already gathering, drawn by the stench of blood and ruptured flesh. The wounded who could not crawl back called for water, for rescue, for mercy. Some cried out all night. Others went silent as the hours passed, their lives slipping away while the stars turned overhead. Back home, the families of these men slept unaware. In the industrial towns of the north, in the fishing villages of Scotland, in the mining communities of Wales, in the green fields of Ireland, mothers and wives lay in beds beside empty spaces where their sons, brothers, and husbands should have been. They did not yet know that their homes would soon be struck by telegrams, thin slips of paper that carried grief like shrapnel, tearing through households as ruthlessly as any shell on the Somme. At headquarters, Haig considered the day. Reports spoke of heavy casualties, but also of gains. He told himself that the price, though terrible, was necessary. The Germans had been wounded. Their line had bent, even if it had not broken. He would press on. Tomorrow, more men would be thrown forward. Tomorrow, perhaps, the line would crack. The king would be reassured. The public would be told of progress. The dead of July 1st would not be in vain. So Haig convinced himself. But the soldiers who lived through that night knew differently. They lay in the mud, unable to move, listening to the whimpers of the wounded and the distant clatter of machine guns still firing into the dark. The first day of the Somme had not been a battle. It had been a harvest of flesh. And when dawn came again, they knew it would begin all over. By the morning of July 2nd, nearly 60,000 British men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing in a single day. The scale was unprecedented in British history, a wound so vast it could scarcely be comprehended. But the Somme was not over. It was only beginning. The command insisted the attack must continue, that the offensive could not stop. The king, soon to learn the true cost, would find himself watching helplessly as his armies were fed into the machine for weeks and months to come. The night of July 1st bled into July 2nd with no real silence. The guns never ceased entirely. Even when the great barrages tapered off, random shells fell across the scarred landscape, exploding in the wreckage of trenches, craters, and mangled bodies. For the survivors of the first day, there was no true rest, only an uneasy drift between exhaustion and terror. Men sat in the bottoms of shell holes with bayonets still fixed, their uniforms stiff with blood and mud, staring blankly at the bodies beside them. The wounded moaned until their voices broke, calling into the blackness for stretcher-bearers who never came. Others whispered prayers, whispered curses, whispered the names of wives and children who would never know how they died. Those trapped in no man's land endured the cruelest fate. Some had been hit in the leg and could not crawl. Others had wounds to the belly, spilling life into the mud. They cried for water, but the canteens of their comrades lay out of reach, still slung over lifeless shoulders. Many were hit again by stray bullets in the dark as German sentries, alert for movement, fired at every shadow. For hours, the land between the armies was alive with the voices of men in torment. And then, as the night dragged on, fewer and fewer called out. By dawn, only the buzzing of flies remained. The Germans, working under lantern light, reinforced their lines. They dragged more machine guns into position, stacked ammunition, repaired damage to barbed wire where the bombardment had broken it, and buried their own dead in shallow graves carved into the chalk. Officers walked the parapets, making sure every position was ready. They knew the British would attack again. The High Command had already concluded that Britain could not retreat after such losses. Pride and strategy alike demanded that the offensive continue. So they prepared calmly for the next waves, confident that their defenses, though battered, would hold. Back at British headquarters, Haig and his staff wrestled with incomplete information. Reports came in slowly, often distorted by confusion at the front. Officers wrote of stiff resistance, but also of some gains. Messages did not capture the annihilation suffered by entire battalions. Haig convinced himself that the attack had achieved partial success, and that further pressure would force a breakthrough. Instead of halting to reassess, he issued orders for renewed assaults. The theory of attrition had taken hold. If the enemy could not be broken in a single blow, then Britain would grind them down with relentless pressure. The soldiers at the front absorbed these decisions in silence. On July 2nd, fresh battalions were marched forward, sent to replace the men lost the day before. They walked through roads clogged with the wounded being carried back, Men with arms missing, faces bandaged, eyes hollow. They saw stretcher-bearers staggering under their loads, columns of prisoners guarded by weary escorts, wagons loaded with corpses stacked like firewood. And still they marched toward the front, ordered into positions where the stench of death already hung thick in the summer air. Behind the lines, the casualty-clearing stations and field hospitals were overwhelmed. The scale of suffering was beyond what the medical services had ever prepared for. Rows of wounded stretched out under canvas tents, men groaning, shivering, delirious with fever or shock. Surgeons worked without pause, covered in blood up to their elbows, their tools never clean, their hands trembling from exhaustion. They amputated limbs by lamplight, sawed through bone while assistants held men down, their screams echoing across the fields. Piles of severed arms and legs grew outside the operating tents, swarmed by flies. The wounded who could not be treated quickly enough were left to die where they lay, given a cigarette or a shot of morphine if supplies allowed. News of the disaster began to filter back to Britain. Telegraph offices worked day and night to send messages to families. Telegram boys on bicycles became dreaded figures in towns and villages. Every knock at the door, every slip of paper delivered carried heartbreak. In places like Accrington, Sheffield, and Hull, whole streets were plunged into mourning at once. Neighbors discovered that sons, brothers, and fathers from the same block had all fallen together. Curtains were drawn, church bells tolled, and the sound of weeping filled homes that had once been filled with laughter. George V received the updated reports later, and with them came the weight of realization. The numbers were staggering, nearly 60,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. The king, though bound by duty to maintain a facade of resolve, was shaken. He had spoken of sacrifice, of duty, of courage, but now he saw the true cost. These were not just statistics, but the lives of his subjects, the lifeblood of the empire drained in hours. And yet, he was powerless to halt the slaughter. The generals held command. His role was symbolic, not strategic. He could visit hospitals, shake hands with survivors, award medals for bravery. But he could not undo the dead, nor could he order an end to a battle once begun. And so the Somme continued. For the soldiers still alive, it became clear that July 1st was not an isolated catastrophe, but the beginning of a campaign that would stretch on and on. Each new dawn brought more attacks. Each attack brought more dead. The front did not move in leaps but in inches, gained and lost again. Every advance paid for with thousands of lives. The British soldiers learned quickly that there was no shelter and no escape. The trenches they occupied were shallow and broken, offering little protection from artillery. The ground around them was open, dominated by German positions on higher ground. Even at rest, they were within reach of machine gun fire and sniper bullets. The sky above them was filled with the constant hum of artillery shells, some screeching overhead, others landing nearby in blasts of earth and metal that killed indiscriminately. The king, reading dispatches in London, could not imagine what it meant to live in such conditions. For his soldiers, life at the front became a routine of mud, blood, and fear. They ate cold rations when they could, drank water tainted with dirt, and slept only in brief, broken intervals, their dreams haunted by the screams of the dying. Rats swarmed through the trenches, feeding on corpses half buried in the walls. Lice crawled in every uniform, tormenting men with constant itching. Disease spread easily, trench foot, dysentery fevers. Yet these were minor compared to the constant threat of bullets and shells. The Somme had begun as a promise of breakthrough. Within 2 days, it was clear it had become something else entirely. A grinding, remorseless machine that consumed men in the tens of thousands, turning green fields into graveyards and villages into rubble. And still the generals ordered the assaults to continue. Still the whistles blew. Still the men climbed the parapets and stepped into the open where death awaited. The early days of July bled into one another, not with clear beginnings and endings, but with the same thunder of guns, the same cries of the wounded, the same stubborn belief from the high command that victory was always just one more push away. For the men at the front, there was no sense of time anymore, only the endless repetition of attack, slaughter, and silence broken by screams. The Somme was no longer just a battlefield. It was becoming a factory of death, and the machinery did not stop. By July 3rd and 4th, new orders came down. Haig demanded renewed assaults across multiple sectors. The logic was simple but merciless. The first day had been costly, but the Germans must have been shaken. If pressure continued, they would surely collapse. Attrition was no longer a concept hidden in strategy papers. It was the lived reality of every soldier. The British Army would keep attacking until the enemy broke, or until the British themselves had no men left to give. Fresh units were marched forward, taking the place of those who had been obliterated. These new battalions could not ignore what they saw on the way up. Roads were choked with ambulances, wagons piled high with the dead, columns of wounded hobbling back with empty eyes. The smell of blood, cordite, and rotting flesh was carried on every breeze. Yet the orders were clear. They would take up position and prepare to advance again. For the survivors of July 1st, the new assaults felt like madness. Men who had crawled back from no man's land, their uniforms torn, their faces streaked with mud and blood, could scarcely believe they were being asked to go forward again. They had seen with their own eyes what waited beyond the parapet: unbroken wire, intact machine gun nests, and a killing field that swallowed entire battalions in minutes. But discipline and fear of dishonor kept them silent. Orders were followed, even when obedience meant death. On July 7th, at Overlurs and La Boisselle, the pattern repeated itself. British troops surged forward after another barrage, only to find the Germans still entrenched, their guns undisturbed, their wire uncut. Men clawed at obstacles under fire, trying to cut through tangles of barbed steel while their comrades were cut down beside them. Whole units were shredded before they reached the first trench line. Others made it into enemy positions, only to discover that holding them against counterattacks was nearly impossible. Each advance ended the same way: heavy casualties for gains that could be measured in yards. By mid-July, the battlefield was already unrecognizable. The bombardments had churned the chalk soil into a wasteland of craters. Trees were splintered stumps. Villages marked on maps existed now only as rubble, their church spires and stone walls reduced to dust. No man's land, once green fields and hedgerows, was now a barren strip of mud and corpses, where the living and the dead were indistinguishable from one another in the filth. Flies gathered in black clouds, feasting on unburied bodies. Rats grew fat on flesh, gnawing at the fallen in the darkness, so numerous and fearless that they ran across soldiers' boots even as men tried to sleep. The king began to receive fuller reports, and with them came the dreadful scale of the losses. 60,000 casualties on the first day had already shocked the War Office. Now, every new attack added thousands more. The telegrams to families multiplied. The casualty lists printed in newspapers grew longer, spreading across page after page. What had been sold as a bold strike was revealing itself as a slow-motion disaster, yet one from which retreat was unthinkable. The empire had committed itself. Its sons were being spent like coin in a battle that devoured them faster than any could be replaced. In hospitals behind the lines, the human wreckage of the Somme mounted daily. Trainloads of wounded arrived constantly. Men missing arms, legs, eyes. Men burned, disfigured, blinded by gas or shell blast. Men silent, their minds broken, staring at nothing. Surgeons worked in shifts that never ended, their tools dull from overuse, their hands trembling from exhaustion. Bandages ran out. Sheets were soaked through with blood. The smell of antiseptic and rotting flesh hung thick in the air. Outside the tents, amputated limbs were heaped in piles, swarmed by flies, a grotesque monument to the price of every failed advance. The soldiers still in the line endured not only physical danger, but the collapse of the world around them. Their trenches, shallow and shattered, filled with water whenever rain fell. Duckboards sank into the mud, and men marched through filth up to their knees. Boots rotted, feet blistered. Skin broke into sores that became infected. Trench foot spread rapidly, blackening toes until they had to be cut away. Lice crawled across every man's body, biting, spreading disease, driving them mad with itching. Even food became tainted. Bread was damp and stale, meat was riddled with maggots, water tasted of rust and chlorine. Yet hunger and thirst forced men to consume whatever they were given. Letters sent home captured fragments of this ordeal. Some soldiers wrote cheerfully, hiding the truth from families they didn't want to worry. Others described the horror openly, their words smeared with mud and sweat, telling of comrades blown apart, of rats feeding on corpses, of the endless thunder of guns. These letters were censored, but enough slipped through to give families in Britain glimpses of what their sons endured. The king himself read some, passed up the chain as examples of morale. Behind their brave tone, he could sense the despair. And still, the battle did not end. Haig insisted on pushing forward, convinced that German losses were just as great, that persistence would eventually bring the breakthrough. Each week brought new assaults. Each assault brought new dead. The front line did not leap forward as the generals had promised. It crawled, inch by inch, mile by mile, bought with the blood of entire generations. By the middle of July, the Somme was no longer just a battle. It was a way of life for the soldiers condemned to fight it, a grinding routine of mud, death, and orders repeated until they lost all meaning. The king, powerless to stop it, could only wait for the next report, the next figure, the next confirmation that his empire's youth were still being hurled into the furnace with no end in sight. The Somme in mid-July was no longer an offensive in the sense that the generals had first imagined it. It had mutated into a grinding contest of endurance, a vast cauldron where lives were tipped in daily by the thousands. The attack of July 1st had been a cataclysm, but the weeks that followed revealed the true nature of this battle. Not one great blow, but a slow, relentless bleeding. For the soldiers, every day was a repetition of terror and filth. Every hour a struggle to survive under the constant threat of steel and fire. By the second week of the battle, the front resembled nothing human. The chalk soil of the Somme, churned by shells, had turned into a grotesque moonscape. Craters overlapped upon craters, some large enough to swallow a house, filled with stagnant water, corpses, and shattered equipment. The trees that had once lined roads and hedgerows were splintered stumps. Villages marked on maps as objectives, Contalmaison, Ovelers, Trones Wood, were not villages anymore, but mounds of rubble, their stones pulverized, their churches collapsed into heaps of broken masonry. The landscape had become unrecognizable, and men who marched forward from reserve lines often could not tell where their own trenches ended and no man's land began. The fighting on July 14th marked one of the rare tactical gains for the British. A night attack, unusual in its timing, managed to catch sections of the German line by surprise. The British captured portions of Bezentin Ridge and entered Longueville village, places the generals had dreamed of taking since the first day. For the men involved, the assault was chaos and darkness, bayonets flashing, grenades bursting, men stumbling through woods reduced to tangled, smoking ruins. Machine guns still cut down hundreds, but by dawn the British had clawed forward. It was hailed in reports as a triumph, and George V, reading his morning briefings, allowed himself to believe for a moment that the tide might be turning. But the truth on the ground was more grim. The new positions were shallow, exposed, and costly to hold. Every gain had to be defended against immediate counterattack. The Germans, recovering quickly, hurled men and shells back at the captured lines. Soldiers who had survived the initial assault now crouched in ditches and rubble, fighting hand-to-hand to keep what they had taken. The ground was soaked with blood, and when relief battalions finally came, they found themselves stepping over heaps of corpses, both British and German, rotting together in the July sun. Nowhere was the horror more concentrated than at Delville Wood. South Africans, fighting as part of the British Empire, were ordered to take and hold the shattered forest. What awaited them was beyond imagining. Trees had been splintered into jagged spears, branches blown away, the ground a tangled mass of roots, mud, and human remains. The wood was filled with machine gun nests, hidden in the ruins, and every advance was answered with a storm of fire. For 6 days and nights the South Africans clung to their positions, without rest, without water, under constant bombardment. They were shelled not only by the enemy, but sometimes by their own artillery, whose ranging was thrown off by the confusion of the battle. By the time they were relieved, their numbers had been annihilated. Of over 3,000 men, barely 750 walked out. For George V, who would later meet the survivors, their ordeal became a symbol of empire-wide sacrifice. Dominion troops bled just as heavily as the men of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. For the ordinary soldier, though symbolism meant little, the daily existence at the Somme was unbearable. Trenches filled with water after rain, and men stood for hours, even days, ankle-deep in filth. The bodies of the dead, uncollected in no man's land, swelled and split under the summer heat, their stench drifting into every corner of the front. Flies swarmed so thick that men ate with one hand while waving the other constantly in front of their faces. At night, rats emerged by the thousands, running across sleeping men, gnawing at the bodies of the dead, sometimes even at the wounded too weak to fight them off. The noise was ceaseless. Artillery thundered day and night, sometimes in great barrages that shook the ground like earthquakes, sometimes in scattered bursts that struck without warning. Men learned to distinguish sounds, the shriek of incoming shells, the rattle of machine guns, the whine of ricochets. But they never grew immune. Nerves frayed. Some soldiers broke down, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak. They called it shell shock, though few understood what it truly meant. Officers often dismissed it as cowardice, sending broken men back into the line. The king, reading medical reports, knew of such cases but could not grasp what it felt like to live for weeks under the unending roar of bombardment. Letters sent home tried to describe it, though words often failed. "The noise never stops," one man wrote. "You feel as though your head will burst. You don't sleep. You don't think. You just wait." Another described the battlefield simply. "Hell has no need to be imagined. We live in it." Yet these letters, censored for morale, were often softened before reaching families. Mothers read words of reassurance when, in truth, their sons lived every moment on the edge of sanity. Medical services behind the lines were drowning in casualties. Trains loaded with wounded ran constantly from the Somme to field hospitals, and then further into France and Britain. Surgeons amputated limbs in endless succession, the sound of saws and screams echoing through canvas tents. Supplies of chloroform and morphine were never enough. Men were strapped down to tables, biting on leather straps while doctors cut into them. The lucky were those who passed out quickly or died on the table. The unlucky lived, maimed for life, faces torn, lungs destroyed, eyes blinded. For the king, visiting hospitals weeks later, these were the men he saw, bandaged, broken, yet saluting him weakly from their beds. His heart carried the weight of their sacrifice, even as the generals demanded more. By the end of July, the British had advanced a handful of miles at monstrous cost. Haig reported progress. The newspapers printed words of triumph. But in the trenches, the soldiers knew better. They had gained little more than rubble and corpses. The Germans, far from breaking, had reinforced their lines, bringing in fresh divisions. The killing would not stop. It had only begun. George V, monarch of an empire stretched across the globe, sat at the center of it all, receiving reports filled with numbers, casualties, prisoners taken, yards advanced. But no report could convey the reality of what his men endured. The Somme was no longer simply a battle. It had become a wound carved into the very body of the British nation, a wound that deepened with every day the assault continued. By August 1916, the Somme had already consumed the lives of tens of thousands, yet the battle pressed on with a stubbornness that defied logic. It was no longer about a breakthrough. Haig's visions of cavalry pouring into the open country had long since evaporated. What remained was a grinding war of attrition, a daily hemorrhage of men for gains measured not in miles but in yards, sometimes no more than a ruined farmhouse, a shallow trench, or a patch of shattered woodland. Each advance, bought at unimaginable cost, was met by German counterattacks that reclaimed the ground or forced the British to cling to it under merciless bombardment. The soldiers knew it. They were fighting not for victory, but for survival in a landscape that seemed determined to erase every trace of human life. The summer sun turned the Somme into an open grave. The bodies from July's first assaults still lay across no man's land, bloating in the heat, limbs stiffening, faces unrecognizable. Many had been torn apart by shells, their remains scattered, half buried in chalk dust and mud. Soldiers advancing through these fields had to step over, sometimes through, the corpses of their own comrades. The stench was unbearable. Flies swarmed in black clouds, covering food tins, crawling into men's eyes, filling their mouths when they spoke. Letters from the front spoke of the sweet, sickly smell of death that clung to everything, a smell that no soap or water could wash away. It clung to uniforms, to skin, to memory. Rats thrived in this environment. Huge, fearless, well-fed on human flesh, they multiplied by the thousands. At night, soldiers lying half asleep felt them scurrying across their bodies. They gnawed at boots, chewed through haversacks, and most horrifying of all, fed on the wounded too weak to push them away. Many men wrote home that the rats were worse than the shells because they came when the guns were quiet, a constant reminder that even in silence there was no peace. Artillery duels defined August. Day and night, the British and German guns pounded each other without pause. The sound was relentless. Shells screamed overhead in endless arcs, tearing into trenches, collapsing dugouts, shredding men into pieces too small to identify. Soldiers described the bombardments as storms, waves of thunder that shook the earth until men's teeth rattled in their skulls. Sleep became impossible. Some soldiers went for days without closing their eyes, their nerves stretched so thin that even the slam of a trench door could send them into panic. Others developed the twitch, the thousand-yard stare, symptoms of what was then called shell shock. These men trembled uncontrollably, lost the ability to speak, or broke down in hysterical sobbing. Commanders, still blind to the reality of psychological trauma, often branded them cowards and sent them back to the line. In early August, the British targeted Guillemot, a ruined village that had become a fortress of rubble. The assault was a microcosm of the whole Somme. Repeated charges against intact German defenses, men cut down in waves, ground captured and lost again. Each time the whistles blew, more battalions rose from their trenches and stumbled into no man's land. Each time, the machine guns spoke, cutting them down in swathes. By the time Guillemot finally fell in September, the ground around it was so littered with corpses that men described walking not on earth, but on the dead themselves. The weather turned against them, too. Heavy rains fell in late August, and the churned soil transformed into sucking mud. Trenches collapsed into themselves, walls sliding down into knee-deep filth. Men moved through it slowly, boots pulled from their feet by the weight of the muck. Rifles jammed with slime, ammunition spoiled, supply wagons sank axle-deep. The wounded who fell into shell holes filled with rain often drowned before help could reach them. For those who lived, the mud became a second enemy, cold, relentless, swallowing everything. Hospitals overflowed with the human wreckage of the Somme. Trainloads of wounded arrived daily, unloaded into wards where overworked nurses and surgeons moved from bed to bed in a blur. The scenes inside were grotesque. Men with faces torn apart, jaws missing, eyes gone, bandaged stumps where arms or legs had been. Some were unrecognizable to their own families when they were sent home. Others would never go home at all, dying slowly of infections that spread from the filthy battlefield wounds. The king visited these hospitals when he could, his presence offering comfort, but also forcing him to confront the devastation his soldiers endured. He shook hands with men who no longer had hands, spoke to men who could no longer speak, and saw in their eyes the silent accusation. Why? Behind the lines, British cemeteries expanded daily. Graves were dug in long rows, crosses hammered into the ground with names hastily written on them. But many bodies were never buried properly at all. Some remained where they fell, buried by the next shell burst, their names lost forever. Others were collected only as fragments, impossible to identify. The earth itself became a graveyard, swallowing men whole, leaving only helmets or bayonets to mark where they had once been. At home in Britain, the reality of the Somme began to sink in. Casualty lists printed in the newspapers stretched across entire columns, page after page of names. In towns where PALS battalions had been raised, the effect was catastrophic. Streets that had once been full of laughter and life became silent. Whole communities were in mourning. Women dressed in black filled churches. Children grew up fatherless. Factories and shops were missing half their workforce. The scale of grief was impossible to measure. The king, aware of the mood, urged the nation to stand firm, to see the sacrifices noble necessary. Yet he himself struggled with the weight of what he read. This was not just a battle abroad. It was the unraveling of the empire's own heart. By September, 2 months into the battle, the Somme had already claimed more than 200,000 British casualties. Yet Haig pressed on. He believed the Germans were being bled dry, that persistence would win. New plans were drawn, more assaults ordered, more lives fed into the line. The king, powerless to countermand his generals, bore witness as the butcher's bill grew longer and longer. Each name another stone laid on the monument of the Somme's futility. The men in the trenches no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of endurance, of surviving one more day, of hoping for a wound bad enough to send them home, but not bad enough to kill them. For them, the Somme was not about strategy or maps. It was about the mud under their boots, the corpse beside them in the trench, the shell that might end them at any moment. And still, every dawn the whistles blew, and they climbed the ladders once more. By September 1916, the Battle of the Somme had dragged on for 2 relentless months, and the British High Command, far from halting the offensive, planned yet another massive push. The theory was unchanged. Continuous pressure would grind the Germans down until their line finally broke. In London, George V received dispatches couched in optimism. The enemy shows signs of weakening. Further progress is anticipated. But the reality in France was an abyss of mud, steel, and corpses. The king's generals insisted that one more great assault might deliver the long-promised breakthrough. And so, once more, the men in the trenches braced themselves for another plunge into the fire. The target was the sector near the villages of Flers and Courcelette. Haig believed that with enough preparation, the line could finally be pierced. The assault was to be supported by a new weapon, one that was whispered about among the troops but scarcely understood. The landship, or what would soon be known as the tank. Heavy, armored, lumbering machines, they were designed to roll over wire and trenches, impervious to bullets, clearing paths for the infantry to follow. For the king, briefed on their existence, the tanks seemed a symbol of modern progress, a sign that British ingenuity could turn the tide. But the soldiers who saw them for the first time were less certain. The machines were slow, noisy, and prone to breaking down. Some wondered if they were more a curiosity than a weapon. The attack began on September 15th, after yet another prolonged bombardment that churned the fields into ruin. At dawn, the whistles shrieked once again, and men climbed over the parapets, their boots sinking into the mud of no man's land. This time, the tanks rumbled forward with them. Huge steel beasts belching smoke, their tracks clanking, they moved ahead like creatures from another world. Soldiers cheered them at first, encouraged by the sight of something that might shield them from the merciless machine guns. And indeed, in some places, the tanks smashed through wire and silenced German nests, creating gaps where the infantry could surge. But the machines were few in number, slow, and fragile. Many broke down before they reached the enemy line, bogged in mud or crippled by mechanical failure. Others became easy targets for German artillery, which quickly adapted, hammering them with shells until they burst into flames. Those tanks that did reach the enemy inspired terror, but they could not change the course of the battle alone. Behind them, the infantry still paid the same price, advancing in waves cut down in swathes, their bodies carpeting the ground. The villages of Flers and Courcelette became centers of slaughter. Ruined walls and cellars were turned into fortresses. German soldiers, sheltered in deep dugouts, emerged as soon as the barrage lifted, manning their machine guns with ruthless efficiency. Streets once lined with homes were reduced to rubble-filled alleys where men fought hand-to-hand with bayonets, knives, and clubs. Whole battalions were swallowed in the attempt to seize a few hundred yards. At the end of the day, the British reported success. The line had advanced, Flers had been taken. But the cost was staggering. More than 20,000 British casualties fell in the assault, another mountain of bodies added to the ever-growing heap. For the soldiers, the novelty of the tanks was quickly forgotten in the face of reality. They still lived and died as before, in trenches filled with water and lice, under skies that rained steel, in fields where friends were blown apart before their eyes. No machine could alter the fact that every step forward was paid for with oceans of blood. Letters written home in September spoke less of victory than of exhaustion. "We are told the enemy is weakening," one man wrote, "but it feels as though it is we who are weakening, not them." Another simply wrote, "I am tired of walking on the dead." The German defenders were under enormous strain as well. Their casualties were heavy, their positions battered daily, their morale stretched thin. Yet they clung to their defenses, rotating divisions, digging deeper, adapting to every British tactic. German artillery remained deadly, their machine gunners merciless, their counterattacks fierce. The Somme became not a British triumph, but a stalemate of mutual destruction. For every German regiment crushed, another arrived to take its place. Behind the lines, the hospitals overflowed worse than ever. By September, Britain had lost more than 300,000 men in the battle, killed, wounded, or missing. Train stations in northern France became scenes of horror as convoys of stretcher cases were loaded onto wagons, men moaning, coughing, some clutching stumps where limbs had been. Surgeons worked until their hands were raw, nurses until they collapsed from exhaustion. The wounded spoke of the tanks, of the endless barrages, of the mud and the rats. But most spoke of their comrades who would never leave the Somme at all. The king followed these reports with growing despair. He made visits to the front, appearing in uniform, walking among the men. He shook hands, spoke words of encouragement, tried to project calm. The soldiers respected him, even cheered him, but he saw in their faces the truth. These were men marked for death, their youth draining away in trenches filled with filth. George V, bound by his constitutional role, could not order Haig to stop. He could only watch as his empire's finest were consumed in the furnace. September bled into October, and the rains came heavier. The battlefield, already a wasteland, now dissolved into a swamp. Trenches collapsed, men drowned in shell holes, equipment disappeared into the mire. Tanks, once hailed as a miracle, sank helplessly into the mud. Horses struggled, wagons overturned, supplies rotted in the open. Still, the attacks continued, wave after wave, men stumbling forward into fire, the same story repeated endlessly. The Battle of the Somme, in September 1916, revealed itself fully for what it was. Not a battle of maneuver, not a breakthrough, but a vast machine of attrition. Every day it ground men down on both sides, with no regard for their courage, their humanity, or their lives. And still the generals pressed on, and still the king received the casualty lists, and still the whistles blew at dawn. October came, and with it the rains that turned the Somme from a battlefield into a quagmire. What little remained of roads disintegrated under the weight of supply wagons and endless columns of men. Shell holes filled with water, merging into one another until the land itself became a swamp. Every step was an ordeal. Soldiers sank ankle-deep, knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep in mud so thick it sucked boots from feet and pulled men under. There were reports of wounded men drowning where they fell, too weak to lift themselves from the muck, their cries fading as the earth swallowed them. Horses collapsed, their loads spilling into the mire, and had to be shot where they lay. Guns bogged down, wagons overturned, and yet still the attacks went forward, as though mud and misery could not halt what bullets and shells had failed to stop. The soldiers in the trenches lived in filth beyond imagination. Their dugouts, never deep enough, collapsed under the weight of rain, burying men alive in the mud. Water streamed down parapets, filling firing bays until rifles rusted and ammunition spoiled. Men spent nights standing because to lie down meant sinking into the slime. Uniforms never dried. Blankets stank of mold. Food, when it arrived, was soaked and rotten. Bread dissolved into pulp, bully beef tins rusted through. Tea became gritty sludge mixed with mud. Every bite tasted of earth. Rats grew larger, bolder, feeding on corpses half buried in trench walls, gnawing at boots and even nibbling at sleeping men. Lice tormented everyone, burrowing into seams of clothing, causing fevers and sores that never healed. Disease spread quietly: dysentery, trench fever, pneumonia. The body became as much an enemy as the German guns. And above all, the shells never ceased. October was a month of artillery duels so constant that men described the sound as an unbroken roar, a second heartbeat that pressed against their skulls. Day and night, shells whistled overhead, some bursting in the distance, others landing directly in trenches, tearing men into fragments, spraying blood and earth over the survivors. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that death could fall at any moment, without warning from the sky. They became fatalistic, shrugging when shells fell near, laughing in hysteria when they were spared. Others broke entirely. Men curled in corners, shaking, unable to speak, their minds shattered by noise and fear. They were branded cowards, but they were victims of a torment no human could endure indefinitely. October's major offensives targeted positions like Le Trans-Loy and the heights near Goodcourt. Each was attacked with the same formula: bombardment, infantry advance, slaughter. The mud rendered every movement impossible. Artillery could not be moved forward. Barrages fell short or overshot, killing British men as often as Germans. Infantry staggered through swamps, packs weighing them down until they could scarcely lift their legs. Machine guns, still intact in German positions, tore them apart as before. Bayonet charges bogged down before they reached the enemy. The wounded who fell into shell holes filled with water were left to die, their comrades unable to drag them out without becoming casualties themselves. The battlefield became not just a place of death, but of drowning, suffocation, and despair. George V received the dispatches in London, carefully worded to emphasize progress. Pressure maintained. Enemy weakening. Yet the casualty lists told the truth. By October, British losses approached 350,000. Whole divisions had been gutted and replaced, only to be gutted again. Dominion troops, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, were drawn into the furnace, adding their blood to the mud. The king read the names of dead regiments. The Newfoundland regiment shattered. The South Africans bled white at Delville Wood. Now the Canadians at Courcelette and Regina Trench, advancing with heroism but paying with thousands of lives. He saw an empire bleeding not at its edges but at its very core. For the men still alive, life narrowed to the smallest routines of survival. Cigarettes became more precious than food, moments of warmth against the cold void. Letters from home were read and reread until the paper fell apart. Men carved charms from shell fragments, carried photographs of mothers, wives, or sweethearts wrapped in waterproof pouches, talismans against death. They joked darkly, sang when they could, told each other stories in whispers in the trenches, anything to keep despair at bay. But every morning, the whistles blew, and they rose once more into the open, their boots heavy with mud, their hearts heavier still, knowing they walked into the same wall of fire that had already devoured so many. Hospitals behind the lines reached breaking point. The influx of wounded was endless. Some had faces unrecognizable as human, jaws blown away, eyes hanging, skulls shattered but bodies still clinging to life. Surgeons amputated until their hands were numb, their aprons stiff with dried blood. The air in wards was thick with the stink of antiseptic and rot. Nurses worked themselves to collapse, moving from one broken man to another, offering words of comfort to those who had no chance of recovery. Men cried for mothers, begged for death, drifted into silence as infection claimed them. George V visited these hospitals, walking among rows of bandaged bodies, offering his hand, his words, his presence. He was met with loyalty, even gratitude. Soldiers whispered, "The king came to see me." But when he turned away, he carried the weight of their suffering silently, knowing he could not stop the machine that was consuming them. October gave way to November, and still the battle went on. The mud deepened, the cold sharpened, the misery grew. The Germans, though bled heavily, held firm. Their lines bent but did not break. The British inched forward, yard by yard, over ground so churned and desolate that victory itself lost meaning. Villages were taken, but they were only rubble. Ridges were captured, but they were only lines of mud soaked in blood. The Somme had become not a battle, but a ritual sacrifice repeated endlessly, demanded by generals, endured by soldiers, presided over silently by a king who bore the grief of a nation on his shoulders. By the time November arrived, the Somme was no longer fought for strategy. It was fought because it had begun, and because to stop seemed impossible. The men knew it. The Germans knew it. The king, though he would never say it aloud, must have known it too. The greatest empire in the world had tied its fate to a battlefield of mud and blood, and the price would be measured in generations lost. November 1916 came, and with it the final act of the Somme offensive, though no one at the front felt any sense of an ending. For the soldiers still alive, it was just another month in the same endless cycle of bombardment, attack, slaughter, and mud. The landscape had become unrecognizable even to the men who had fought on it since July. Fields had turned to seas of mud. Shell holes had merged into lakes. Villages had been erased so completely that only map references told men where they were supposed to be. What little remained of the countryside, trees, barns, roads, was nothing but splintered fragments sinking deeper into filth with every rainfall. The cold brought new torments. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow, and the trenches became ice-rimmed channels where men shivered uncontrollably, their hands numb, their breath turning white in the freezing air. Mud that had once sucked men down now hardened into jagged ridges that cut into boots and skin. Men wrapped rags around their feet to ward off frostbite, but many still lost toes and fingers to the cold. Blankets were soaked, uniforms stiff with dirt, lice burrowed deeper than ever. Sleep, already scarce, became almost impossible as men tried to rest in waterlogged dugouts where the chill sank into their bones. The king, reading reports in Windsor and Buckingham Palace, knew the battle had dragged on far longer than intended. Haig still spoke of progress. He insisted that German losses were greater than British, that the enemy was nearing collapse, that the Somme had served its purpose. And yet the casualty lists continued to grow, now totaling more than 400,000 British dead and wounded. George V, bound by duty, repeated in public the language of perseverance. But privately he was haunted by the knowledge that the Somme had consumed an entire generation of his subjects. His empire was bleeding out before his eyes, and he could do nothing to stop it. The final major action came in early November at Beaumont Hamel. The 51st Highland Division was tasked with attacking the German positions that had held firm since the first day of the battle, when the Newfoundland Regiment had been slaughtered. Now, after months of attrition, the British believed the defenses might finally crack. The attack began in darkness, with men trudging forward through frost and mist. For once, the artillery preparation was effective. The German wire was torn open, their dugouts smashed. The Highlanders advanced with ferocity, bagpipes skirling through the chaos, their kilts caked in mud, their bayonets gleaming in the pale sun. They stormed the trenches, fought hand-to-hand in dugouts, and finally took Beaumont Hamel. It was hailed as a victory, the capture of a position that had defied the British since July. The king was told of the achievement, and for a moment, in the corridors of London, there was talk of success, of the Somme ending on a note of triumph. But for the men on the ground, the price was the same as it had been every other day. Thousands more lay dead or dying in the mud, their bodies scattered across fields that had no meaning beyond the maps of generals. The ground gained was measured in yards, not in the thousands of lives it had cost. By mid-November, the weather made further fighting impossible. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the corpses still lying in no man's land, covering trenches in ice. The guns fell silent not because the war was won, but because the battlefield itself had become unworkable. Haig declared the Somme a success. The British line had advanced 6 miles at its deepest point. The Germans had been forced to commit vast resources, had lost men they could not easily replace. The French were relieved at Verdun. But at what cost? 420,000 British casualties, 200,000 French, nearly 500,000 Germans, 1 million men in total dead, maimed, or broken. The king read the final tallies with grim resignation. He had spent the summer and autumn visiting hospitals, touring camps, speaking to soldiers. He had shaken the hands of men without hands, looked into the eyes of boys with faces burned away, listened to the silence of those who had no words left. He had seen the grief in towns and villages, whole communities stripped of their sons. He knew the official language of victory, rang hollow against the truth of what had been lost. And yet he could not say so aloud. His role was to embody perseverance, to give meaning to the sacrifice, to assure his people that it had not been in vain. For the soldiers, the end of the Somme brought no relief, only exhaustion. They left behind a battlefield so devastated that it would remain scarred for generations. Graves stretched in endless rows, many with no names, only the words known unto God. Families across Britain, the Empire, and the Dominions received the dreaded telegrams, each one a blade cutting into the fabric of society. Mothers dressed in black, fathers stood silent in grief. Children grew up with only faded photographs of men who had never returned. The Somme became not just a battle, but a symbol. It represented the futility of modern war, where courage and sacrifice met industrial slaughter. It was remembered as a betrayal of the faith of the ordinary soldier, who had trusted that his duty would mean something, only to find himself sacrificed for a few yards of ground. For George V, it was a stain on his reign that no later victories could erase. He had presided over an empire at war, but he had also presided over its greatest single day of loss and the months of attrition that followed. When the battle officially ended on November 18, 1916, the men still alive in the trenches scarcely noticed. To them, it was only another day. The mud was the same, the rats the same, the lice the same, the hunger and the fear unchanged. They had lived through 4.5 months of hell, and they knew more was coming. The war was far from over. The Somme was only one chapter in a story that had no end in sight. The king, writing in his diary, spoke only in the briefest words of the battle's close. But in his heart, he carried the weight of every name on the casualty lists, every soldier buried in the fields of France, every family left broken at home. The Somme was his war as much as it was Haig's or the soldiers'. It was his reign's defining wound, a wound that would never heal.